people are aware of at all. How did that come to your attention? And so tell us about it. I'm sorry, some of it's in the title, but
Sure. Yeah. Well, the thing that people don't know about Poe is that he was extremely interested and engaged in the science of his time. Some people may know that because there's a collection on Edgar Allan Poe's science fiction, the Penguin Classics, that I read in college, and I was blown away by it. I didn't know where these stories were coming from. Like every junior high student who grew up in the US, you read Poe, you read The Telltale Heart, you may know about the mysteries, you may know about the Dupin stories, which are the huge influence on Sherlock Holmes. And
right, but you don't read Arthur Pym.
You don't read Arthur Pym, and you don't read Mesmeric Revelation. You definitely don't read Eureka, which is this giant cosmology that he wrote at the end of his life, and that he said just before he died, now that I've written Eureka, I'm ready to die. And that's what drove me to learn more about it. Why did he think that this cosmology, this theory of the universe, where it came from and what it's made of, this scientific but also quite fantastic, quite philosophical, and very literary history of the universe, why did he think that was the most important thing that he'd done during his lifetime? So I did something that other biographers haven't done, which is to take that work and all his other writing in popular science, his work on shells, on seashell spotting, and all the scientific themes in all of his works, and take it really seriously and put it, like he did, at the center of his life, at the center of his writing, and tell the story of his life with that front and center. And a very different picture shows up. He's not just the inventor of detective fiction, or this huge pioneer in horror stories, or the kind of crazed, drunken lunatic that some people take him for because of the characters in his stories. All that's there, but he's also quite often a sober, very reasonable, very rational author, journalist, philosopher, who's right in step with the huge changes that are happening in his lifetime in the sciences and in technology and in inventions, at a time when the US is really undergoing a lot of quite explosive changes in the early 19th century.
I find that fascinating because Lovecraft, of course, was a deep admirer of Poe, but part of it must have been for this part of his work as well as the horror. I mean, he clearly knew Arthur Gordon Pym, and I mean, that is to say, he knew the story very well, and some of the others. And Lovecraft himself, of course, was deeply involved in science. So that's fascinating. Do you touch on Lovecraft in the work?
I foreground those things that Lovecraft drew upon. The way that Poe is fascinated with old texts, with archaic, abstruse learning, and with sometimes that are made up. You know, he invents books that he finds in the bookstore, the ancient stories of magic and mystery, but also this idea of the cosmic, the limits of our knowledge, the kind of terrifying range of things that lie beyond human experience, which Poe is always pushing up against, and for Lovecraft becomes the central obsession.
Right. Of course, Poe was also a pioneer in cryptography.
Definitely. He had a whole series in the newspapers that he wrote in Philadelphia, where he'd invite readers to send him encoded messages that he would then crack, and said in cryptography, like in so many parts of life, it would be possible to find a simple method to explain how I do this. And eventually he applies that same logic to a simple method to how do you write a poem? How do you write a short story? And eventually, how do you understand the origins of the universe? And that's an obsession of the period too. Everyone in the 19th century is saying, in this early 19th century, there must be a method that allows us to understand everything, to build anything, to analyze, to construct anything. It's a great moment for enthusiasm, but also skepticism about science and method as a way of cracking the code of the universe.
Mark, I have to ask, are you a Sherlockian?
I do, yeah. I've got the new annotated Sherlock Holmes at the bottom here. Yes, yeah, they're a very dear gift actually from my father.
I see on your shelf behind you a Sherlock Holmes puzzle.
Sherlock Holmes game. Yes, yeah, I do love Sherlock Holmes. And
so it took a lot of chutzpah to call Poirot the greatest detective in the world. So,
well, I will apportion the blame for that to my editor. But he made a very good point with saying that this is a self-described. This is what Poirot says. So he says, "I'm the greatest detective in the world." And I said, oh, you can't call it the greatest. The first thing people are going to say is, well, what about Sherlock Holmes, or what about, he said, oh, well, it's a good conversation starter. And I thought, oh, that's probably a good way to think about it. But yeah, absolutely, I'd say, I mean, you know this, that when you read especially the early Poirot stories, they are Sherlock Holmes pastiches. I mean, it's so clearly Sherlock Holmes and Watson, but translated to Poirot.
Well, Poirot, I mean, Christie was certainly a fan, and so did you take the Sherlockian approach, which is, obviously Agatha Christie is just the literary agent, and
I did not actually. What I wanted to do with this book was, and we sort of called it a biography, but it's like a biography of Poirot, the phenomenon, more than Poirot, the character. So what I really wanted to do was talk about the fact that Poirot's just had a centenary. And I was like, well, this 100 years of Poirot straddles sort of, obviously, Agatha Christie's original short stories and novels and plays, but then all of these adaptations, all of these appearances in media, all of the other stuff that we associate with Poirot, like there is bigger part of it is anything. And more, possibly the most controversial thing I've ever said, which people keep coming back to me annoyed about, is I said in another book that you can sort of be an Agatha Christie fan, or say you are, and never have read an Agatha Christie book. And that I've had lots of people say to me, oh, I love Agatha Christie, but they've actually only ever seen the adaptations. And I found that really interesting, that Poirot is more than just the Agatha Christie creation. Poirot's
it doesn't surprise me personally, because I gave a talk once about at the Lilly Library, no, at the Newcomb Library in Chicago, about Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle. And after the talk, a woman came up to me and said, "I'm so glad I came to your talk today. I didn't know there were books."
Wow.
So the revelation, I guess. Now, so we're joined here by Richard Greene, who wrote The Unquiet Englishman, A Life of Graham Greene. No relation, Richard? You're on mute. Could you you need to turn on your sound there.
My apologies. I had a little bit of difficulty logging on earlier, but yeah, no relation at all. But it has changed my name. I have a parenthesis after my name, no relation. So that's the way my life is. Every time my book gets reviewed, my name gets changed.
So Greene had been biographized before, I believe. So what brought this subject?
Yes, there were two earlier biographies. One was particularly harsh and interpreted the evidence in such a way. People use the term for that kind of biography as criminography, where when anything's in doubt, you always assume the evil of the character. And the other was the official biography, which had pluses and minuses, a lot of good research. But in the third volume, covering half his career, the author had succumbed to Alzheimer's and yet continued the project. And so, at the risk of being unkind, it's a deeply flawed outcome. And the reviewers made much of this at the time. I was a reviewer. We didn't know what was going on, so we said harsh things. But it meant that there was still a need for a well-known author to have a biography.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk a little bit about how you all did your research, and in your case, John, you didn't have to deal with the family, but Jamie and Richard and Mark, you all probably did in some respects. So tell us about your research process. Richard, you gotten in the least talking so far. We'll start with you. So tell us about the process of how you pulled this together.
Most of the work was actually done in libraries. I was once told by a really established literary biographer to be very careful of eyewitnesses speaking long after the fact, because they've been telling the same story for 50 years and improving it every time. Mm-hmm. So be cautious of that. So I relied mainly on documents, but I did have some living witnesses, particularly in the family. Graham Greene's daughter was very forthcoming in her way. There are things she didn't want to talk about and couldn't be prodded into. And his son didn't want an interview, but was willing to answer single questions. So I sent him a good many single questions. There were a few members of the family who were difficult, guardians of the flame that thought that I'd done terrible things by saying, well, he probably told a lie here. And this was an outrageous thing to do. And but you got to live with it. The document said he was lying. And so, you tell that. But on the whole, it was a rich experience.
The days of authorized biographies, I mean, authorized is always a word that frightens me when I see it on a book of any sort. Jamie, you were dealing with lots of people who knew Tony well.
But also the authorization issue came up early because I wanted to write an independent biography, and Tony Hillerman's daughter, Ann Hillerman, is the executor of the estate. And so I explained in the book the agreement we had. She would get to read the manuscript twice when it was completed, once when I turned it in and once when it was edited. Any factual mistakes she found would be corrected. I mean, who wouldn't want to, get the year right? But the more important clause was anything to which she objected to would be taken under serious consideration by the publisher and by the author, meaning I wasn't bound to remove stuff, which allows the book to represent an independent view of Hillerman. To my advantage, unlike some other families, and having run a biography organization, I can tell you nightmarish stories of dealing with the estates. Justin Kaplan famously said, the first thing you want to do is kill off the widow. And it gives you a hint of what goes on. Anne had been a journalist for most of her life, so she understood the nature of maybe Jamie's take on this particular thing isn't what I would do, but he's the author. And so I really had a remarkable relationship with her to do the book. Just a little more, there were 5 adopted children who were very reluctant to speak to me because they viewed me as sort of the National Enquirer coming in to dig up dirt about their dad. Sure. So it took a long time of trust building before I was able to interview them. And in the end, that was a very good story too. They were very pleased to have a chance to chat.
Mark, the Christie company, I mean, that's a mega enterprise. It rivals the Burroughs people in terms of sort of control and all that. Were they welcoming?
Yeah, so I had written another book, Agatha Christie on Screen, a few years ago, which was not, which I researched with the help of Agatha Christie's grandson Matthew, who at the time
was a lovely guy,
who is such a nice guy, and we I think that by doing that and always showing him what I was doing and not really having any serious conversations about what he would or wouldn't want, but just me saying, by the way, this is what I'm doing. There was a sort of mutual trust there that I think built up, which really helped me with this one, which did come out from her publisher, this one, the Poirot one. But what we found was that me with Agatha Christie Limited and with the Agatha Christie Family Trust was that actually this sort of thing is mutually beneficial, in that actually they find it quite helpful to find out more information about things that they didn't really know about. I mean, just yesterday I had an email from Agatha Christie Limited to say, we've had this query about these adaptations. Do you know where this came from, or this number of adaptations and so on? So actually it's sort of, I get to be someone who can help them out, but they're also very light touch, as light touch as you can be really with it. And by sort of working alongside them, because they were interested in my work, it meant that I got access to stuff that certainly hadn't been seen by people before. I had the dream sentence that was said to me that any historian loves to hear, which is, we found this box file somewhere and nobody's looked at it for at least 30 years. We don't really know what's in it. And so going through things like that was an absolute treat. So I built up a lot of trust with them, which really helped and sort of opened a lot of doors.
John, were you reading 19th century science? Did you have to do a lot of that?
Quite a lot, yeah. Because with Poe, it's not that there's a lot to discover. It's that there's too many biographies out there. There's too many stories already. And his own autobiographies that he published have been sifted through, and all the fictions are and things that he made up have been revealed. But they do create a kind of dissonant view of who he was as a person and what his central concerns were. And one of the things that has been really profoundly hidden is this interest in science all along. So for me, it was a question of connecting the dots between his writing, his life, the kind of peaks and valleys of his experience, and what's going on in this broader context of scientific publication, education, training, which is undergoing as many transformations as Poe's own life. So in a way, it's a biography of American science at the same time as it's a biography of Poe. And the two are intersecting, going back and forth all the time. So I read all the biographies and read the sources that those are based on, but of Poe. But then I was also going to archives of scientific institutions in Philadelphia and New York, Baltimore, reading the journals from the time, reading a lot of books, a lot of background to know what the big debates are in these years before there are any unified scientific institutions in the US. There's no national framework for science, and people are trying very hard to make that happen. And Poe is very tangled up in that story. So I had to retell that story as well, which was, for me, really exciting to see, oh, this story of Poe's, which people know the descent into the maelstrom, they don't realize that it's actually engaging with this debate about where do storms come from, which is tearing up the scientific institutions in the US. There's a New York interpretation, there's a Philadelphia interpretation, and these teams of scientists are battling it out on the question of, are they pulled up into the air by heat, or are they cycles, tornadoes? And the whole scientific community is riven by this debate. And that happens over and over in these years. And Poe's there making allusions to those debates throughout his life, throughout his writings.
It's a very different time in the history of science than the way we perceive it today. The word scientist is brand new. And we don't have science. I mean, I guess I think of science as being conducted by either academic institutions or commercial institutions.
Right.
That was not the case then.
No, it's mostly gentlemen amateurs, people who have the spare time, who have the resources to gather collections of shells, geological specimens, of books, because there aren't great lending libraries. It's very hard to get hold of the newest publications coming out in London or in France or in Germany. And so it's a few people who are able to devote themselves to it. It's often physicians or people in medical schools at this time who have the time to research on biology, electricity, which is seen as connected to biology. What you see is how so many fields are really closely connected, and a few people will know a lot about a lot of other fields. It's a moment where things are starting to specialize, where you get people who are physicists and not chemists, but there's still a great deal of cross conversation among it. And as you say, the job of scientist or the job of researcher barely exists at the time. And that's part of what's happening in this period, is there are people who are saying we need to set up the institutions for this to be a profession, because outside of universities, outside of these networks of gentlemen amateurs, there's a huge hunger in the press for sensational theories and speculations. I mean, this is the time of P.T. Barnum and the Fiji mermaid, all kinds of frauds, all kinds of forgeries, all kinds of really wild theories about where the universe came from, which are theologically really dangerous, or, for some, they seem to be threatening the account in the Bible. It's a few decades before Darwin. There are also lots of theories of the origin of species and of the origin of the Earth that are just really out there. And everyone's looking for perpetual motion devices or ways to make use of electricity. And Poe is part of that world too. Writing hoaxes, also debunking hoaxes.
Well, it's also probably the last time ever that an amateur could be involved as a generalist. I mean, this really was sort of the end of being generalists in science.
Yeah. And that's kind of where I get to in the story, that with Eureka, this cosmology that he wrote at the end of his life, he was pinning all his hopes on this. This was going to be his huge breakthrough. This was going to be his origin of species. And he dies a year afterwards. And actually, in the course of his life, that kind of general theory of everything is no longer possible outside of these newly professionalized spaces of science. And it falls flat. He wanted to publish 50,000 copies, and the publisher published 500 copies. And it took years for people to go back and read it and figure out what was in it.
None of us have ever had that experience. So, Jamie, what was the biggest surprise in your looking at Hillerman's life and career?
it's always a toss-up. There are two major surprises, one of which is he had no intention to do what he ended up doing. He was actually, and I love telling this to mystery writers, he was actually writing a mystery because he thought it would be pretty easy to do, a kind of warm-up act before writing his great American novel. And when I've been with mystery writers, they, throw eggs at me. But the other thing was finding a kind of overarching explanation of what he did. Very, very briefly, the Navajo's spiritual life is centered around finding harmony. And they have particular ceremonies that focus on working on returning veterans of the war to get rid of the badness that they've been exposed to. Hilleman suffered from PTSD, having been severely wounded almost fatally in World War II. Granted, that's not a term that was used in World War II, but he was later diagnosed with that. And I think it explains his kind of emotional obsession with having Joe Leaphorn and Jim Chi constantly describe this drive for harmony and peacefulness, which is, I think, why he continued writing 18 of these books, even when he wasn't doing it very well anymore. Those moments still sing out. And that, I feel, is sort of my contribution to explaining Hilleman's work.
Richard, were there surprises in your investigation of Greene's life that other people had not spotted before?
There were a good many, though perhaps as I was thinking about that question of surprises, the most surprises came in the area of intelligence work. That he was famously and almost inexplicably a defender of the defector Kim Philby in the West. That when Kim Philby fled to Russia in 1963, Graham Greene spoke up for him. And he had, in the war, Greene had been the MI6 representative in Sierra Leone, then he was brought back to London, and he worked in an office under Philby's supervision, just as Philby was about to take over British intelligence against the Soviets. At the same time, he was a double agent. A massive intelligence breach for the West, huge. And we came under major suspicion in the 50s, and eventually, after being confronted in 63, he left. Greene kept speaking up for him ever afterwards. And my best guess about how all this happened was that Greene was mad at MI5. You recall the difference. MI6 does foreign intelligence. MI5 chases defectors within. And MI5 had gotten on his back about the novel Our Man in Havana, that he had revealed too much of method, and that he was about to be prosecuted at the Old Bailey for what he had revealed.
Wow.
The head of MI6 laughed at the head of MI5, but I think Greene just had a chip on his shoulder afterwards that anything MI5 does, including against Philby or anybody else, I hate them and I will fight them. And so I think that was the biggest surprise for me in the writing of the book, but there were lots of little ones, but that one especially.
Mark, you've had a chance to prepare now. And think about this.
Yeah, I think that in general, one of the things I found really interesting was how much you have to fight back against some things that you innately think are true, especially things from, say, her autobiography, which sort of so ingrained in the popular understanding of what Agatha Christie thought about certain things and how and why she approached her writing. She barely talks about her writing in her autobiography, and she talks about it almost as if it's just a sideline. And when you actually go through all the material, you really find that she was obviously taking it extremely seriously. It was something that she spent a lot of time really planning and thinking about. And there were a few sort of projects that to date have only really had sort of throwaway mention in either biographies or discussions, which I felt were really, really important. One was a film called The Alphabet Murders, adapting the ABC murders in 1965, which was going to turn her novel into a sort of sex comedy with Zero Mostel playing Poirot. And to actually, that sort of mention in passing almost is like a joke sometimes in like biographies. And when you actually dig deep into it, I found that that was a really traumatic experience for Agatha Christie to actually say, she is 75 years old at this point, and that she thinks that she signed away rights for MGM to make a lovely, lavish film. And they've got a film that's got jokes about women rubbing themselves against Poirot in a lift. So the idea that somebody could take her, creation and do something to it, absolutely changed the way that she dealt with everyone after that point. And she stopped reading scripts. She said no to everything. And so for me, that was a massive turning point in her career, to suddenly she didn't trust people. And she was like, I was always a bit distrustful, and people said that I should, trust people with this project, and I've been proven to be right. And so things like that, projects have been much more important to the development of the character and her career than I think had been given credit for before.
John, were you surprised by the Poe science connection, or was there a particular element that was a big surprise?
Yeah, one of the things that I really dug pretty deeply into was, I knew he was very aware of science. He went to West Point, so that was pretty much the best training in astronomy and engineering and mathematics you could get in the US at that time. I knew he had that background, and there were surprises of references that he made in various stories to contemporary science. But to me, what was kind of the biggest revelation was how much he took seriously the theological debates that were part of the scientific debates at that time. So the question of, is the universe created by God and held together by God, actively maintaining it? That was a central tenet of Protestant theology, that God's there, omnipotently holding the world together, watching it and keeping the clock turning. But there was a new set of theories that said God may have created the universe, but he built it as a clock that then unfolded in a predictable, regular way, which was very scandalous to the Protestant theologians. People saw it as one step in the direction of atheism. And what I found is that issue is one that he is wrestling with throughout his writing career, making references to those debates, making references to those questions. I found the copy of one of the theological books of the Bridgewater treatises that he actually owned, and he scribbled this really furious response to one of the authors who's an idea of kind of original sin that he's against. Likewise, there was a popular science exhibit in 1845, which was called the Eureka Machine, which he used that title for his own cosmology. The Eureka Machine was a kind of clock, an automaton, or an early robot that produced verse, that you wound it up and it would produce mechanical poetry. But the author of the person who made the Eureka Machine said it's also meant to be an illustration of kaleidoscopic evolution, which meant, I had to reconstruct what the heck did that mean. It meant the mechanical understanding of the universe that the theologians were so afraid of, that there's a random turning of a kaleidoscope that puts things into a certain beautiful order, but then you turn it again and a new order emerges. So really, he's, from the start to the finish of his writing career, he's not just taking on board science and in getting involved in these debates. It's also got these massive theological consequences. And Poe is not the first person you think of as being a theological thinker at all.
Exactly. Richard, I want to come back to you one more thing about Greene. I was pleasantly surprised. I shouldn't have been surprised about his love of Victorian fiction, crime fiction, and that he collected it. I later discovered, his little catalog that's been published that he did with Dorothy, and it's become my map of the things I collected as well. I also collect crime fiction. So,
yeah, he absolutely loved that stuff. He grew up on it, really, an Edwardian childhood, and he and his brother and one of his girlfriends just pursued those things avidly. And one day they put out the particular book you're speaking of, and it was cheerful for him. He was, as a writer, very close. Oh, there you've got it. Yeah, he's very close to genre fiction. Thrillers, detective stories. Even as he was trying to write literary fiction, he never went too far from the detective story or the spy novel. Yeah.
So this is the hard part of the panel now, guys, because it sounds like a commercial. I know you'll all feel reluctant to do this, but why do you want people to read your book? What about your book is important for the general reader? There's a really nice question. Jamie, we can start with you.
Well, thanks.
Who cares about Tony Hillerman?
Everybody else gets 5 minutes. I think there are a couple of things. One, we're having a major discussion of who has the right to tell whose story, the whole notion of cultural appropriation. And when Hillerman wrote his first Navajo novel in late 1960s, that term cultural appropriation hadn't been around. And when he died in 2008, it was becoming a contentious debate. And so watching Hillerman, how he did his work, how can you cross cultural barriers and write about the other, is an important issue in the book. And I think the people I interviewed and the things I found might enlighten that debate. The simple commercial reason sometimes to read the book is if you like Hillerman books, it tells you how each of his books were written without giving away the spoiler. So, you learn about why Jim Chi was invented and how Leaphorn was not a Navajo name and all these kinds of fun things. But I'll tell you this, I'm heading to the store to buy everybody else's book because your presentations of them are riveting.
Mark, there's no Poirot clubs. Are there? I mean, Sherlockians are everywhere and organized, but
Yeah,
you may start something here.
I may start something here. Yeah, it's interesting because people tend to be about Agatha Christie rather than the individual characters. So sort of fan of her, and that was why I wanted to write this book. The first pitch I sort of had to the publisher was to say, I want a book where you can sit down and you've perhaps just read, I don't know, Murder on the Orient Express, and you want to know about it. You want to know the context of it. You want to know where it came from. You want to know how it links with her other works, get an idea as to any trivia, any adaptations. And that's what I really wanted the book to be about, was to tell the story of Poirot across 100 years, but also work as mini contextual pieces for all of them. And if I could just briefly give one example, I think it's really interesting that she writes Evil Under the Sun, which is a lovely sunny murder mystery of Poirot's on holiday in 1939. And by the time it's out, it's sort of 1941 in most places. It's published in 1941, where it's the Blitz, and that's what Agatha Christie is living with. And I think that reading the book, thinking about how it straddles those two years is really, really interesting. That you've got to sort of think about what her mindset was, what she was trying to do with each of these novels. And sometimes it was just she needed to write a novel to pay a bill. But sometimes she's really got something to say about a particular topic, often justice and especially in her later years, she's very concerned about the rise in crime. And you can see that a lot in her later novels, that there's a real link there between her concern about that and the way that characters are treated in her novels.
So, Richard, what's the takeaway for people? Why should anybody care about Graham Greene?
That's it's a tough question to answer because I have so much to rabbit on about that subject. That I guess I would boil it down to this: that Graham Greene was an immensely complicated, very gifted novelist. A novelist of great power, changed a lot of lives. People, it's hard to go to an AA meeting where someone doesn't have hidden under their jacket a copy of The Power and the Glory. But also, Graham Greene is a writer who manages to navigate the national boundaries of the 20th century. It's not a simple thing, as James is remarking, because you have to be very careful of appropriation of voice, that a lot of his novels are set in the most troubled places on the planet, and his journalism includes yet more places. And I make the claim early in the book that the phrase "life and times" is very important. That it's not just his life, but the times he lived in. There's two sides to every story. It's not just you go to a country and the people who live there are just a backdrop to some white guy's psychodrama, but you're trying to give a two-way street. So there's a lot of necessity to see this particular writer in rich, detailed contexts. And I think when you do that, it kind of cuts both ways. You both get to know a wonderfully gifted, troubled, fascinating author in himself, but also in his engagement with the world that's made our world.
John, everybody knows Edgar Allan Poe. They think they know Edgar Allan Poe. Your book is a revelation. I mean, that's one reason I think people should read it, but you have your own suggestions, I suspect.
Well, certainly bringing out this scientific side is very important, I think, and it's going to be a surprise. It's way different than the cliched versions that we have of him as just this tortured genius who died young. He was very engaged in these things that were of vital contemporary interest. And I also can include the context and show how that weaves through his life and times. He was born in Boston, raised in Richmond in the South, and then spent his life mostly in the North. So he sees the emerging conflict over slavery from all sides. He's very rich when he's young. He's poor through much of his life. So the American experiment is something that he sees from every possible perspective. And that when you know how to pull those threads out, when you start to see how they show up in the writing, I'm hoping it gives a vivid sense of the period as well, and where lots is changing. But the scientific side is what I focus on. That's part of the American story, that the creating of national institutions for science are also part of building a unified federal state and building the idea of what America is as it's conquering the West, as it's fighting the Mexican-American War, as it's extending settlements further and further west and to the South. That's what Arthur Gordon, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym is in part about, the creation of an American empire in the South Seas, or the vision of that's driving a lot of the scientific research. But there's a sense in which the ways in which he writes about science and the way he's positioned in these public debates where you don't know who to believe is really a story that's completely relevant to our time. I mean, the genres of science fiction and mystery writing that he contributed so much emerge at a time when there's not a strong scientific authority, when it's questioned, when people who speak the facts or the truth about science are doubted left and right, because there's so much noise in the public sphere. And so the term fake news doesn't exist in the 1830s, but it's absolutely what's going on in his time. And the skepticism that's ginned up about climate change or about public health, that's exactly the kind of phenomenon that Poe's in the middle of, and participating in, critically highlighting, and making quite visible in ways that I think will be very familiar to people living now.
I think it's also a time that readers forget is before the invention of what people now call genre. Writers like Poe wrote about what interested them. It didn't matter if it was horror or science fiction or mystery or whatever. It was a compelling story. And Poe was certainly one of the shining examples of being able to be successful in all of those of interest. We won't call them genres yet. So let me remind the audience, by the way, if you have questions, please post them in the chat or in the Q&A feature. We have one question, Mark, about Poirot's mustache and Kenneth Branagh's interpretation of it.
Yes, this is interesting. Kenneth Branagh says that it's because Poirot often refers to him as mustaches. So he's like, oh, so it could be big. You can have a mustache on a mustache. I don't know if people have seen the new Death on the Nile film, newish, but there is a whole backstory for the mustache, and it's interesting that it's become such a big thing that just a mustache, just like any old sort of drawing of a mustache, immediately goes on the front of most Poirot books. That's like the way that you say that this is a book about Poirot. So it's important, and I know Kenneth Branagh said that. Well, whatever you think about it, his interpretation of it, he said that it was taken very seriously by the Agatha Christie Limited people when they had the conversation about the mustache. So yes, I haven't seen the specific question, but it's definitely important, the mustache.
Well, first, let me say congratulations to all four of you on these incredible books. But tell me, what are you working on now? What's next? Jamie?
I'm actually editing a book. It's called The Writing Life of Writing Lives. And there are essays by biographers of tales from the trenches, how they, found a document that no one had, how they persuaded somebody to come up with an interview, or how one woman was sued before she'd written a single word. Those kinds of things, kind of bedside reading.
Mark, another Christie book, or?
Yes, yeah, perhaps inevitably. I've just started on Agatha Christie's Marple. So Miss Marple is next in my sights. And I found some lovely
Ooh.
things already. So I'm quite looking forward to that. I've set myself a nice long deadline though, so it's not coming out anytime soon. But
Well,
yeah,
I'm
that's
fascinated
next.
by Marple because she was so clearly based on Anna Catherine Greene's Amelia Butterworth, and another figure of Victorian crime fiction, Richard, that I'm sure I know Greene appreciated very much. Richard, what are you working on next?
Something much simpler. I'm trying to finish a book of poems. So yeah, one day it'll reach that massive length of 64 pages or whatever the magic number is, and then we'll go with it.
And then the publisher will only print 500 copies. And
I should be so lucky. In Canada, 300. Thank you very much.
John, is there another Poe-related topic or something?
No, it's
completely
taking off perpendicularly because that book, Eureka, he dedicated to Alexander von Humboldt, who was the Prussian explorer who mapped out much of South America. And the book that he published that Poe was referring to is Cosmos. So I'm going further into history of science and writing a history of images of the cosmos. So Humboldt's part of it, but it goes back to Newton, it goes back to the medieval period, and it goes forward to Higgs boson and Hubble images.
Wow.
But Poe definitely inspired it with Eureka as a very particular vision of what the universe might look like.
Well, my next project is another collection of footnotes, this time about Jekyll and Hyde. So that'll come out in November. Well, we don't have any questions from the audience. So I'm going to let you guys ask questions of each other. Anything penetrating you want?
I'd like to ask Mark a question.
Please.
You know, in assembling descriptions of Poirot, did you find inconsistencies by the author, making him heavier, smaller?
Jamie, I don't think I found a single consistency. But she was very open about that. This is the thing, is I sort of say early on in the book that you can't really say, oh, this is a biography of the fictional person. It's got to be of, you know, the sort of phenomenon of Poirot. But she does the old Watson thing of injuries. I mean, he limps initially. You know, he's got to be about 125 by the time we get to the last book. So huge.
Royal
huge.
Jelly.
Yeah. It's massive inconsistencies, but she didn't mind. I quite like that relaxed attitude, really, that we as fans might go, didn't you used to live there, Poirot? And suddenly your flats are slightly different. But she didn't mind. And so you've got to almost let that go and say, it doesn't matter. It's just interesting to see how she saw him at each time, rather than try to do the Sherlockian approach, as you were saying, Leslie, and really try to make it all fit together. Got to relax a bit and go, perhaps not so much. I'm interested to know about other people, about what people found perhaps most difficult, if there was anything that they couldn't get access to, or something like, is there like a lost thing that they tried to track down and never could? I'd be quite interested to know about that.
The interview with Hellerman, that never happened. And the same with you, Richard, I suppose. I mean, you know, finding the author's own words is the tough part. So.
Yes, I did not meet him. I had one opportunity to meet him in 1990 and it didn't happen. So, and that would have been a meeting at a social event. So no, I didn't. I would say what I lacked in terms of what I really wanted to get my hands on are just secret documents, you know, things that come out after 40-year rules and 75-year rules. Yeah. And that, and also had to accept that at times was being lied to, because there were a certain number of Russians involved. Sorry, that sounds like racism, but I mean Russian intelligence agents, actual, you know, FSB, KGB people. And so that, you know, you just you look at that and you report what's said.
One audience member asked, by the way, if you want to work this into your answers here, what did you do before you wrote biographies? This is an unusual group in that we have essentially all biographers. Mark, yours is a perhaps fiction, but very much biographical. Did you do other things, guys?
Well, I did things in decades. I spent a decade as a journalist, and then I spent a decade working in book publishing and magazines. Then I had a midlife crisis and spent a decade teaching high school. And then now I'm a decade and a half in being a full-time biographer. So my aunt used to say, when are you going to grow up and do one thing?
My wife always says to me, when are you going to write a real book?
Ooh.
Well, my day job is teaching history of science. So that's what I've done before, and I've kept doing. And the unfindable thing that I've been looking for, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't exist, is the smoking gun proof that the people who came up with the Big Bang Theory, Friedman and George Lemaitre, read Poe's Eureka, because it basically follows step by step exactly what Poe said is the history of the universe, a single particle exploding outward in a flash. And I know that Lemaitre would have known the people who were reading Poe at the time, but there's nowhere that he says, read Poe's Eureka, wow, great idea, I think I'll do the math for this. But Friedman, the Russian scientist who came up with another version of the Big Bang, said his favorite authors were Dostoevsky and Poe. Still, I'd like it to get a little closer, but it's out there. It's possibly out there.
Richard, did you have a life before biography?
No.
Poetry.
Oh, no, I'm just being silly. I teach English in a university. Students are nice, colleagues are nice, but I tell you, if you've watched The Chair, it's all true.
I'm a
And Mark,
university lecturer as well, yeah, and film and television's my area of that, but my undergrad degree was in English. But I love archives. That's the thing that really excites me, and that's what, we were saying about footnotes earlier, Leslie, but you were saying that you were a footnote writer. I mean, that for me is the most exciting thing. All the good stuff is buried in I think about 1,600 footnotes in the Poirot
Well,
book,
that's why that's why we are of the same feather, all of us here. So, well, this has been a stimulating conversation. I'd already read all your books, but I hope that the audience has discovered some new and exciting topics. Join us on April 28th for the Edgar's Awards. You'll see links to various things at edgarawards.com. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and for writing these magnificent books.
Thank you. It's great fun making it.
Thank you for your time. It's great to be here.
Yeah, great to meet you all. Thank you.
Bye.
Anything more, Kathy? Or is our work here done?
Your work here is done. I don't know where I am, but your work here is done. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for
Bye.
Lovely to meet you all.
John,
Yeah.
are you at University of Toronto, aren't you?
I'm at University of London.
Oh,
I'm
okay,
in
sorry.
England. It's Richard who's in Toronto.
Oh, okay, that's why.
But
Anyway,
I hate to admit it, I didn't want to do it in recording, but I haven't read Hillerman, but you have more than convinced me of
oh, great.
how exciting that's going to be. So thanks so much. It
Well,
sounds
thank you.
great. Where would I start? What should I start with?
Of his books,
Yeah.
the third one, Dance Hall of the Dead.
Okay. It's that.
I'll send you a note. Don't worry about remembering.
Okay.
See you all.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Kathy. Bye-bye.
Bye.